Okay, now we're going to cover 5.2 clear cutting. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the effects of clear cutting on forests. We're going to do this by first describing what clear cutting is and then talking about those effects. So clear cutting is removing all the trees from a certain area. And this is done because it's considered to be the easiest and most efficient way to remove lumber. So before I talk about the disadvantages, first let me give the advantages some airtime. So some pros to clear cutting is that it allows for areas of the forest to be harvested all at once. So this means the equipment comes in one time, builds one road, and cuts all the trees that they're going to harvest, and that's it. It's not a continued disturbance. Proponents of clear cutting also state that it mimics natural disasters. So there are disasters like a wildfire or a heavy storm, which may knock down a lot of trees or burn up a lot of trees, allowing more sunlight to reach down to the ground. So the clear cutting mimics that same process. Some species, such as Douglas fir, which is frequently harvested, needs a lot of sunlight as a young sapling to grow. So by cutting out the bigger trees, we're giving those saplings more sunlight, and therefore they'll grow a little better. I also want to note that it is required that the clear cutting sites must be replanted within 2 years. While those things are all great, we must also mention those disadvantages. One of the disadvantages of clear cutting is soil erosion. So when the tree's roots are no longer in the ground and providing that structure for the soil, it causes a lot of that soil to be washed away by rain. This soil that's washed away eventually deposits as sediment in local streams, causing what's called turbidity. That's how cloudy the water is from sediment. And as it does, it also removes the organic matter from the soil, and the nutrients that would normally be in the forest have now washed out and are in other areas, such as the stream. This also affects the temperatures of stream and of the soil. So without this tree cover, the direct sunlight is now going to hit the water, and that's going to increase the temperature of our water. And it's also going to increase the temperature of the soil. Soil has a lower albedo. This is a measurement of how much sunlight is reflected. So it doesn't reflect as much, it absorbs it, and therefore it increases in temperature. Another disadvantage is landslides and flooding. So the sunlight, again, is directly hitting on that soil, and because of that lower albedo, it dries out the soil and it leads to a decreased water holding capacity, meaning it's no longer holding that moisture inside the soil, it's getting held on the top and flooding or creating landslides. Clear cutting, as I said, requires the loggers to also replant the forest. This creates a plantation of trees such as you see here, which is great, but at the same time, all the trees are the same species and the same age, and therefore there's an overall loss of biodiversity. There's not the cycling of nutrients of trees of different ages. There's not habitats for different species. We've got one species which is fairly susceptible to diseases or other adverse events. Our forests provide many important benefits. First, they filter out air pollution. So as they take in the CO2, they're also taking in any air pollutants which may be in there. So we call this scrubbing. And this estimates that one tree can do $60,000 worth of air pollution for us in 1 year, which is pretty impressive. As they're taking in CO2 and photosynthesizing, they're storing that CO2 as carbon in their bark and in the mass of their trees. So this is removing CO2 from our atmosphere that would otherwise be contributing to climate change. And they also create habitats for many different species, which is important for the diversity of our forests. One way of clear cutting is called slash and burn deforestation. And this is where you cut down all the trees and then you burn them. So we can compare an intact forest, which shows that there's an equal balance between the CO2 coming out and the CO2 coming in. So trees naturally degrade over time, so they're going to release CO2 as they decompose. And they also perform their own cellular respiration, where they do release some CO2, but they're making up for that by taking it in when they photosynthesize. On the flip side, we see that clearing and burning of forests just release CO2 because you're cutting down those trees, releasing all that stored carbon in their biomass back into the atmosphere. This graphic is pretty interesting because it also shows us regrowing forests and shows that forests that are regrowing over time do capture back some of that CO2. And lastly, we have a conversion of a forest into pasture in agriculture or urban areas. Again, we see that same big contribution to CO2 without the trees to remove that for us. To summarize, we've described the effects of clear cutting on forests, and we've discovered that forests take in and sequester CO2 and filter air pollution. Cutting down forests and burning them releases CO2, and clear cutting results in soil erosion, increased soil and stream temperatures, and a loss of biodiversity.